Hi, guys. Welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and today I have a special lineup for all of you. You don't have to put up with my insufferable behavior this entire time. You do, but not as much, because you'll recognize at least one of these people from previous shows, and one is a new friend of mine who has been connected with me through this old connection. So today we have Jordan Ferrier, who's in the middle there, and then you have Dr. David Allen on the right. And if you've been sleeping under a rock lately, you might not know this, but he just recently released another book on Romans, because apparently having another one on Romans wasn't enough. And he is an expert in all sorts of different things. So I'm excited to have this conversation. My friend Jordan, many people know this, is kind of like a dad to me, but he's helped me quite a bit on theology and stuff. He's been on the channel before. So gentlemen, welcome to the Church Split. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm thankful that you chose to come on to this whole group of ruffians, but we like to have a good time over here. But one of the things is so actually, it's kind of funny that Jordan was the one who made the connection, because I'd been meaning to reach out for a while, but Jordan reached out to you, and then he's like, dude, I've got David Allen's contact info. We should have him on. And I was like, yeah, we should. So here we are. And for those who don't know, I want you guys to check out his books. Links are in the description below. His 2-part Romans book and his recent book on Calvinism are all there. So you can go check those out. I heavily encourage you to pick them up. As per usual, the writing is stellar and all that. So anyway, so gentlemen, let's go ahead and just jump into it. So recently, I wanted to first talk about your first book briefly, but I want to focus, I think, primarily on that second book. I think is where it's the real action's at.
There's 3, not 2, Will.
What was that?
There's 3, not 2.
3?
So, yeah, well, first of all, in case you didn't know, Will Hess wrote a book.
Yeah.
But Dr. Allen put out the book, Just Calvinism.
Oh, yeah.
Was that, a year and a half ago?
Yeah, about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah.
Right, where different people wrote, Leighton Flowers wrote a chapter.
Oh, I was talking about the books on Romans. Right. He's written more than 2 books.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Just making sure.
So
because I know that
first one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. That's the first one.
And this is the one that just came out.
Correct.
Yes.
So the one on Calvinism, actually, I distinctly remember your chapter, because the opening salvo has been burned into my retinas, which is essentially limited atonement is the Calvinist is the Calvinist doctrine still in search of a verse.
In search of a text.
Let's go. At that point, you had me locked in. So
that quote's in here. It's in here.
Yes. So
if you want
now the 2-part. Yes. Now, the thing is, so Dr. Allen, with your recent book on the 2-part Romans, could you explain a little bit what that book is and why you thought it was interesting? Because I really liked your approach on it. Go ahead and explain that quickly for the audience, why you think that might be beneficial for them.
Sure. Thank you for that. Let me, and thank you both for having me on. Let me see if I can do that succinctly. Basically, to the Jew first, 2-part Romans, a structural game changer. Notice the title ends in a question mark. So what I'm doing is, of course, throwing out a proposal here and saying, hey, is this feasible? Is this possible? Essentially, what I'm arguing is when you do a deeper dive into the book of Romans in terms of how Paul makes use of pronouns in Romans and the antecedents to those pronouns, it becomes very interesting that you can actually make a case that the first half of Romans, Paul is writing either predominantly or maybe exclusively to Jewish Christians. And then the pronominal usage shifts a bit in 9 through 16. And there you can make the case that Paul is addressing Gentile believers, still talking about the Jews, particularly in 9 through 11, but that he's actually addressing Gentile believers. Now, the heart of the argument is the pronoun usage when you look at that. And you discover, for example, that in Romans 1 through 8, several times, Paul clearly addresses Jewish believers directly. He doesn't say Jews and Gentiles, I'm talking to you. He says, you Jews. And so he's addressing them in first person direct address. Never does he do that with Gentiles in chapters 1 through 8. In chapters 9 through 16, he never addresses directly Jews. But he does directly address Gentiles with pronominal usage on 2, if not 3 occasions in 9 through 16. And so there's just a very interesting usage of the pronouns, and this is the gist of the basis of what I'm working off of. And what I'm doing is suggesting the hypothesis that maybe when Paul wrote what he did in 1:16 of Romans, that the gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Greek, that is not only true chronologically in terms of the history of the early church, and not only true theologically in terms of the priority of Israel, but that it also could be true literarily, such that Paul writes to the Jew first. He says, Jewish believers, I'm going to talk with you, and then Gentile believers, I'm going to talk to you. Now, one thing that all scholars on Romans agree with is that the church, or churches, if you have several house churches, which is likely in Romans, are composed of two groups of people. You've got Jewish believers and Gentile believers. The second thing that virtually everybody agrees is that there was friction between those two groups. Virtually every Romans commentator agrees with that. Romans 14 and 15 is hard evidence for that friction. And so, whatever Paul is doing in Romans, and of course, there are many suggested purposes behind the writing of Romans, but one of the things that most people believe Paul is attempting to do is to bring rapprochement, to bring reconciliation between the Jews and the Gentiles there. I think that's very likely. In fact, I think that's the most evident purpose. I think Paul has more than one purpose in writing, but I think that's the most evident purpose that can be articulated from a careful reading of the book of Romans. And so that's essentially what this book is about. I try to go through and say, let's look at the pronominal usage and determine, where is Paul clearly talking to Jews? Where is he talking about the Jews? Where is he talking to Gentiles? And then where is he talking about the Gentiles? And so the last part of the book, there's a concluding chapter that gives some options of how much what percentage of viability one might give to the various options there. And so, in essence, that's what the book is about. In one sense, that book is kind of volume one to the Liberating Romans from Reformed Captivity book, which is an attempt to tease out, all right, if this is true, and if Paul is writing the first 8 chapters to Jewish believers, how might that impact particularly Reformed theology's interpretation of Romans? And so the second book builds out of the first book. But the second book does not presume and base the case that the two-part Romans is true. Two-part Romans may not be true, but yet the second book is still a valid critique, in my judgment, of Reformed theology's treatment of the book of Romans. So that's, in a nutshell, the synopsis of the first book.
Yeah, and that's where. So what I thought was interesting about the first book, because I'd never heard that hypothesis either, and I grew up like heavily dispensational.
Yeah.
I wouldn't consider myself a dispensationalist anymore, but I grew up that way. So it's funny because I feel like that, especially the dispensationalists, would eat that up. But because I was like, oh man, boom, there you go. Now even your Romans as a distinction. But what
Yeah.
I liked about your approach was the fact that you even mentioned at the beginning, this was a new idea brought to me. Thought I'd just look into it, and I don't really know where I stand on it yet. It seems like it's got some interesting stuff though. And you just literally just presented it as an idea. And I think there's like in this space, because as Jordan was liking to harass me about, I wrote a book. In this space, a lot of the books end up being very similar to mine, which is I have this belief and I think these are the evidence that shows it. So I'm pushing my thoughts out there. However, this was interesting because you literally just were like, I don't know if these are my thoughts, but it's interesting. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing.
Well, the way I concluded the book, these are my thoughts now, or this is my opinion now. I do think a very good case can be made for two-part Romans. I do believe that, and that's the purpose of this book. But we'll see how scholars respond to it, and hopefully enough will There needs to be discussion and debate. That's what it's all about. I invite that. I hope that occurs. I hope people will interact with it and say, yeah, I think there's some possibilities there, or say, David, I don't know what you were smoking when you wrote that book, but it's pretty weird there. I'm, people can respond however they would like, and I do hope we'll get more response. We've had some response. We've had a lot of positive response. We've had a little bit of negative response. My Calvinist friends are less happy with that first book. They perceived that since I was not a Calvinist, that I'm going to take this in a direction they don't want to go. Well, now they know with the second book, they're extremely unhappy with it, and particularly the title. So,
well, especially I'm sure the title, and that's I guess this is a good time to go ahead and talk about that, because I mean it is a bold title. I mean, it is Liberating Romans from Reformed Captivity. Now, full transparency for the audience, I have not yet read this book, and I haven't started it. Mine's in the mail. It will be there Thursday because Jordan is such a fine friend. He got me a copy. However, I will say this. This is what I've heard from today. I was just at Trinity today, which, by the way, guys, trinitysem.edu. You go check out Trinity Seminary. It's where I'm going. I'm a student. Dr. Allen is actually a professor there. You guys will already know, you're familiar with Dr. Braxton Hunter and Dr. Jonathan Pritchett. But I was just at Pritchett's office today, and he said the book was great. And everyone tells me chapter 3 should be a must read for every seminarian. But also, from what I understand, Dr. Allen pulls out a lawnmower and just gets to work. So that's the way it was kind of described to me. But now, so with that, this is one of the areas where, again, why it's nice to have a friend like Jordan around who is got like a weaponized tism on this sort of thing. But because he's already read this. But so Jordan, what are your, go ahead and you can go ahead and interact with Dr. Allen, I feel like, at this point, because I have read the 2 parts Romans. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun read. It's actually on my shelf right out at my office. But what are your thoughts on the book so far? And and especially with something like Liberating Romans from Reformed Captivity, I'm sure we could definitely talk about that.
Yeah, I have an introduction written, but I just want to tell everybody, I have none of this. I have the book. I haven't even read it because I have no emotional intelligence. And you're supposed to tell somebody 3 nice things before you tell them something that's wrong. And I think the world of Dr. Allen. He's agreed to come on, and he asked me to give him my blunt assessment. And we only have time for the things, I want this to be better. Because this book is really good. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying there are mistakes that you made. I'm going to call them mistakes, because I'm blunt, so.
Are we talking about the Calvinism book? We're talking about book number 2, or
I'm talking about both of them. Yeah,
okay, both of them. Okay, right. I'm with you. Go ahead.
So let me read this. I wrote this because I read your book this weekend, and I wrote this. Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. The goal of a Christian is to be more like Christ. Jesus is true. Christianity is true. Christianity is a pursuit of the truth, which is Christ Jesus. Augustine said things that are true, and Augustine said things that are false. Aquinas, Arminius, Calvin, they all said things that are true and things that are false. As Christians, we need to pursue what is true. So we need to agree with Augustine, Aquinas, Arminius, and Calvin when they say things that are true, and have the intellectual integrity to admit when they say things that are false. The same goes for us as individuals. This is why we do philosophy and theology in community. I need people like Will Hess to point out when I am wrong. We all do. Being a Christian, being someone who loves the truth, we need to be willing to accept correction and go where the truth is, because the truth is Jesus. One thing I really want to avoid is misrepresenting another Christian. I am not a Calvinist, and I believe that Reformed theology and Calvinism are deeply disturbing and wrong. However, if someone says something that Calvin believed is wrong, and I know Calvin was right on that topic, or Calvin really taught something different than what they're saying he taught, then I'm going to sound like a diehard, hardcore Calvinist when I defend Calvin. Because misrepresenting another Christian is bearing false witness. And we should all want to believe what is true, which includes accurately representing historical facts. And I just want to read from page 100 of your second book. Dr. Allen, quote, Calvinism, Arminianism, and Lutheranism all miss the import of what Paul is saying in Romans 9:13. Augustine is the source of all the error, unquote. And not only do I agree that the problem is Augustine, as you so well point out in this book, but you're an Arminian, is my understanding. And you're saying, look, even Arminianism is wrong. If you look at the title of this, Liberating it from Reformed Captivity, Arminius was reformed.
Right.
Romans needs to be liberated from Arminian philosophy because Arminius agreed with Calvin on so many things, even
Right.
total depravity.
Yes,
Well-
total depravity. He did agree with Calvin on total depravity.
Yes, so there's a lot of overlap there.
Well, real quick, for the sake of clarity, I mean, before we let you go further or anything,
Right.
so would you say that, Dr. Allen, would you say that, do you identify as Arminian? I don't know if you identify as Arminian.
No, I
Okay,
don't.
I was like, I don't. I was like, I don't.
I don't, and I really never have. There are several reasons. And I know that I realize, Jordan, you're not making this mistake, but let me address the audience on this mistake. Many people get in these debates and they believe that there are two buckets, that everybody is in one of two buckets. You're a Calvinist or you're an Arminian.
Or a Pelagian.
Now, right.
Arminians and Pelagians are the same.
Right. The reason that is so bad is it shows an ignorance, number one, of history. You don't know church history. And secondly, you really don't know theology. And I have a simple question that stumps my Calvinist friends that want to argue that these are the only buckets. Where do you put Lutherans? You see, Lutherans, if you study Lutheran theology, Lutherans are not Reformed. They're not Calvinists soteriologically. They may have some aspects of Reformed. I'm talking about Reformed in their soteriology,
like modern day Lutherans.
Yeah, and
modern day Lutherans are like Catholic light.
Right, but they never have been Calvinists. You know, the big debates in the latter part of the 16th century was between the Reformed and the Lutherans. All right, now so there's the first thing. So where do you put Lutherans? Well, there are a lot of other people. And the point is, and I don't want to belabor this, but it's impossible to put everybody in one of two buckets.
Right.
And so that's the first thing. People get confused. They think, well, you're either a Calvinist or an Arminian. See, I'm not either. I'm not Reformed. I disagree with Reformed theology ecclesiologically as well as soteriologically. But I'm not Arminian either, because I do not believe that election is based on foreknowledge, although some Arminians are corporate election and, don't either. But the majority of Arminians historically have believed that. And number two, I believe in the eternal security of the believer. So there are two reasons right there why I'm not Arminian in my theology at all. And so I'm not either, actually.
Okay, well, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have limited time, so I'm going to press on.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Because I have stuff I want to get to.
Go right ahead.
Okay, so one of the first things that I wanted to talk about is causation, because I think that you're taking a view of causation that is used in modernity. So, like, if Will is holding onto a glass and I walk by and I bump into him, Will is going to say, you caused me to spill my drink on me, or you made me right? You made me spill my drink on me because I ran into him and it dumped on him. I
Right.
mean, that's how we think of causation. Okay. Calvin used medieval causation, which goes back to Aristotle. So if you read, Aquinas wrote a book on Aristotle, and Calvin and even Louis Molina are using Aquinas's version of Aristotelian causation. So I'm going to try and be really brief, okay?
Sure.
because
That is
because I
not your
know
strong suit.
I know, but I know there's a quote where Calvin says God is the cause of everything that is done. And you go, oh, God's the cause of evil, and God causes people. And we're reading that and saying God's making people do evil. God's making people rape people, and and that's not what's meant at all. So think of it this way. I don't know. I think of the book uh, To Kill a Mockingbird. I don't know if you've read that book, but
Yes.
Atticus Finch, he's this staid lawyer, and his kids don't, really think that much of him. But there's a rabid dog walking into town, and the sheriff walks over with a rifle, and he's like, Atticus, I can't do it. You got to take the shot. And Atticus takes the rifle, he walks out in the street, and he shoots the dog. It's this amazing moment for his kids to see their dad do that. So, we look at that and we're like, well, Atticus caused, you know, he was the cause of the dog being shot. But that's not how Aquinas and Calvin and Molina would look at it. Okay. So let's say the rifle was made by Remington. Okay. So in Aristotelian causation, Remington is the efficient cause of the rifle. The material cause is this rifle is made out of wood and steel and maybe glass and a scope. The formal cause is that the material has taken the form of a rifle, and the final cause is this is made to shoot things, to protect yourself or harvest your dinner. Okay, so so they would say the first order efficient cause of the dog being shot is Remington. Now, Atticus took the rifle. He is now the second order efficient cause because he's the one that had the rifle. He's the one that took the rifle out in the street. So Atticus is the efficient cause. The material cause is the rifle. The formal cause is that he's shooting. And the final cause is he's eliminating a threat that if anybody got bit by it would kill him. Okay? So the first order efficient cause of the dog being shot is Remington, but we don't hold Remington responsible for the dog being shot. That's what Aquinas and Calvin and Molina, everybody that's using medieval causation is doing. They're using Aquinas's Aristotelian causation. God is the first order efficient cause of the entire universe.
So in a sense, are you saying that it's because he's the first mover, so therefore he would be the first cause
Right.
of all things? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. So God, in the beginning, God
That was
created.
one sentence. That was so
Right.
much easier.
But so God is the first order efficient cause of every single thing that is done because you can't break the chain of causation. That's the kalam. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. So if I began to exist, I have a cause. So anything that I do can be traced back to that cause, which can ultimately be traced back to God. So when Calvin says that God is the remote cause, he's saying that God is the first order efficient cause of all that is done because God is upholding the universe. And with God without God upholding the existence of you couldn't do that thing, good or evil. So the causation stuff, they're looking at it very differently. They're saying, the remote cause would be the first order efficient cause, the intermediate cause would be the second order efficient cause, and then the proximate cause would be the third order efficient cause. So when you're talking about causation in your book, and I'm reading it and going, yeah, if we're using causation the way we think about it in modernity, that's bad. But when you think about it from the way that they're using it, it's not, it's right. what
But
he's saying is actually true.
now for pushback on this, though, to be fair, on even like people like Dr. Allen or myself, or even Warren McGrew, or the other people, Leighton Flowers, all of us who do this. The reality is, though, is that even though, yes, Calvin and them may have meant it in the sense of like a first cause situation, like we're talking about, like there's got to be a first cause in order for there to be a second cause. Sure, but everyone still accepts, and even nowadays, even Calvinists say full on that God causes all things. But first, before we get moving on that, I just want to say, Mind Warden, thank you for your super chat. He says, I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Allen, but I assume Jordan is going to take up all the time. So I'll just say, God bless you, gentlemen. Even Will.
Mind Warden is a good friend of mine, Dr. Allen. We had a conversation like this for 2 hours last Friday.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's a great guy.
So real quick, Mind Warden did ask a question. So to Dr. Allen, and I think that especially because what I do want to talk about, like we could talk a little bit about the little things here of because I mean sometimes it is I learned this when I did atonement studies. It took me a while to sift through a lot of stuff. Whereas also
so many details. Yeah.
Well, not only that, but it's like same words, different dictionaries. Sometimes when you're reading ancient texts, and it's like it's a thing, even though that the Reformation is not ancient, but that's still old.
All right. What's his question so I can answer it?
So he says, does Dr. Allen think that God is displaying what he's doing for the vessels of mercy to the vessels of wrath? The language seems to imply it's to make them jealous in turn, hence the patience. So what is your take on that, Dr. Allen?
I would say that is exactly right. And I would say when you compare Romans 9 to Romans 11, you get an accurate picture of what is taking place in Romans 9. And the idea that clearly the vessels of mercy, if you read carefully in Romans 9, include that statement is inclusive of Jewish believers and Gentile believers. In fact, it's in that paragraph, it's in that little section there where in Romans 9, the first mention of Gentile believers comes in the statement about the vessels of mercy. And so it is obvious that Paul elaborates on this in chapter 11, where he is attempting to say, hey, the Gentiles believing are going to cause the unbelieving Jews so far who have been hardened to be jealous, and to give them, therefore, an opportunity to repent and to move out of the category of being hardened unbelieving Jews into the category of being vessels of mercy. That's the whole problem with the Calvinist paradigm of vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy, and the concept of divine determinism, the concept of unconditional election, trying to be elaborated out of Romans 9 is basically the vessels of wrath are described within Calvinistic theology as being the reprobate. But in chapter 11, guess what? Hocus pocus, the reprobate can become vessels of mercy if they will believe. And they're grafted back in. That's the key to Romans 9. And I don't understand how so many of my Reformed friends are blinded to it. They cannot see it. And I know one reason why they're blinded to it. It is because they have bought into the concept of individual, personal, unconditional election. And that's why they're blinded. They're not seeing the corporate scope of what Paul is saying. Now, let me be fair. My Calvinist brothers and sisters admit that Romans 9 is corporate. If you read Tom Schreiner and read Doug Moo carefully, they're saying, oh yeah, it's corporate, but yeah, it's also individual, and it's an example of individual personal election. Well, hey, wait a minute, hold the fuck.
Try to have it like your cake and eat it too.
Where are we getting that exegetically? And particularly Romans 11 would seem to essentially undo that approach, that hermeneutical and exegetical approach. So in answer to Mind Warden's question, I would agree with the way he's framed the question, and I would essentially answer the question by saying yes.
Yeah, if I could, to just push back on that a little bit. to me, if you're saying these individuals are predestined to election and these individuals are predestined to reprobation, what's the difference between saying it's individuals versus saying these nations are predestined to reprobation and these nations are predestined to election? And I just think that the views of Romans 9 that you have given, while they are headed in the right direction, that they need to be corrected. And I really think that I could explain it to you and that you would agree that you're still there's things that you're saying that the reason Paul said this, and then you give the reason, that if we gave a different reason and you saw how that's supported by the text, that it would make even more sense.
Well,
with all due respect.
Yeah. Well, and received with all due respect as well. Let's just plan on you and I having a conversation here in the near future about that, where we can take all the time for me to listen to your points.
And I got a lot of quotes for you.
And then I'll be happy to respond.
Yeah.
You know what? Let me just say this, not to, because obviously we could get too far here.
Right.
But the point that I'm making, that I'm arguing, is that the error, I'm making the argument that the error is that what Paul is talking about is unconditional personal election to initial salvation.
Yeah, that's definitely the
and I'm arguing that's false. That is not what Paul is arguing. That
we agree.
Arguing is the benefit of salvation, which contextually in Romans 8 is eschatological. It is final salvation. And that's why I go through Romans 8 showing the connections with the eschatological language, and particularly the Romans 8:29. What is it that we are predestined to? It's not salvation. No, in fact, nowhere in Scripture is anyone said to be predestined to be saved. What we are predestined to is the final benefit of salvation, which is glorification. And that is my argument. So, anyway, we can, let's definitely have.
When I read your book and I underlined something, I either put why I disagreed or a quote that would explain it better. But if it was like, this is right, outstanding, like I underlined it because it was so good, I put an exclamation mark by it.
Well, I hope you found one or two of those.
Like the last 3 chapters of your book, there's a whole bunch of underline and a whole bunch of exclamation marks. What you wrote towards the end, those last 3 chapters, I'm like, oh man, chef's kiss. Those are awesome.
Nailed it.
Well,
so real quick, let's go ahead and like shift this for a minute here, because we can really get into the weeds. And I mean, that's like honestly, if we wanted to, I mean, you could get really nitpicky on all these things. Like that's because like there's so many little nuances, and you can get lost in the weeds real fast, and you can lose the audience and everyone real fast. So what I think would be really good when it comes to liberating, because that's what we're talking about. Like the focus is liberating Romans from the reformed clutches, essentially. And the idea is that people have looked at it as like almost a systematic theology book. Like Jordan and I were talking about this just the other day. People go at it like it's a scientific textbook. And really, that's not the right way to look at it. It's more of a pastoral letter trying to, like you mentioned, the center of it, whether you're a 2-part Romans person or not, is that it is trying to talk about this reconciliation between these 2 people groups. Right. So when it comes to liberating Romans from that sort of thinking, why do you think people go wrong with it? We mentioned Augustine. I'd love for you to unpack that for a minute. And then also, like, what do you think is the biggest stuff that people really mess up when they approach Romans?
Well, yes. Let me begin by saying, and all of this is in the book. What I'm about to say is in the book and teased out in the book. Whether somebody wants to agree with it or not, that's a different story. But it's obvious Reformed theologians admit that Calvinism is essentially Augustinianism. And what we mean by that is the framework, the grid and framework that Augustine brought to Romans is essentially the framework that the Reformed theology uses today. Now, there have been some changes. There have been nuanced things have been nuanced and so forth. But Augustine is the one who initiated the concept of unconditional election. You do not have the concept of unconditional personal election in the church fathers prior to the later Augustine. You also do not have the concept of irresistible grace prior to the later Augustine. Nor do you have the concept of divine determinism that as defined and described by Augustine in the first 300 years of church history. And so Augustine is the fountainhead of Reformed theology. Now, Calvin, what happened in the medieval period? There was much more work done by, people like the dumb ox, one of his famous titles that was given to Aquinas. Also, his other title, by the way, was the angelic doctor. And so you've got Aquinas in the 13th century who comes along. There you go, right there, the dumb ox. And of course, that's not meant, by the way, to be disparaging. That's a title.
It's a compliment.
It's a compliment of how strong the guy was, But, you have him, and then you have later medieval theologians who are building off of what Aquinas is doing leading up to the Reformation. And what they are doing from Calvin's perspective is this. They are tweaking Augustine more than Calvin is happy with, because they are returning to a level of free will that when Calvin comes along, he thinks they've gone too far, and Calvin thinks we need to go back to Augustine. And so Calvin's work, and essentially his institutes, and he quotes Augustine on virtually every page, and basically says, my whole theology is Augustinian, and you could just take what Augustine said, and that's what I believe. I have that quote in there.
I use the same quote in my book, so it's funny.
Yeah. So Calvin is heavily influenced by Augustine, right? Well, and then what happens is Calvin is continuing to formulate a strong doctrine of unconditional election and what we call today, effectual grace, irresistible grace, and so forth. Now, it needs to be said, not that we can discuss this here. I have a book of 842 pages on this if anybody wants to read it. But neither Augustine nor Calvin held to limited atonement.
Oh, yeah, that's correct.
Both of those men believed in unlimited atonement. In fact, I think my book on the extent of the atonement demonstrates that. Let me just put it this way. The book has been out 9 years. Not a single Calvinist has refuted anything I've said about Augustine or Calvin in terms of the extent of the atonement. Now, they may disagree. I'm just saying there's been no refutation of that. And so Calvin, you don't really have limited atonement. Limited atonement's a new kid on the block. You don't have limited atonement until Beza in 1586. Almost nobody holds to limited atonement in church history until Beza does. At least no one that can be clearly shown to articulate it. Other than Gottschalk, the French monk in the 9th century, who was a devoted follower of Augustine and took Augustine's double predestination to levels that the church councils basically condemned him for. Mm-hmm. And he tried to argue limited atonement, and he was condemned for that. Now that's another discussion. But my point is, in answer to your question, so essentially, after Calvin, you have the scholastic phase of Calvinism, of Reformed theology, which are tweaking things and putting it. You have you have Dort and you have Westminster, and the scholastics are doing their thing. And then you get into the modern period, and you get into Jonathan Edwards, the American theologian, who promotes what is today the majority view within Calvinism on how freedom of the will relates to divine sovereignty, and that would be compatibilism.
Which is just determinism with lipstick.
Yeah, compatibilism is determinism. Don't make any mistake about that. Compatibilism simply says that God determines all things, but the level of free will that people have is what I have called, and I stole this from Ken Wilson, it's non-free free will.
Right.
It's no valid definition of free will that any philosopher, Christian or otherwise, understands from a libertarian perspective. And so, anyway, okay, here's the bottom line. So there has been since Augustine, and I quote the Calvinists who said Joel Beakey, all these various strong Calvinists say that Augustine set the stage and that Augustine's interpretation of Romans is the foundation of Reformed theology's interpretation of Romans. And so my viewpoint is, okay, if I can demonstrate that hermeneutically, exegetically, and theologically, as well as philosophically, that Augustine erred in his interpretation of Romans, then a major part of Reformed theology collapses. Because of all, in terms of Reformed theology, Romans is their key book. If Reformed theology loses Romans, they're in trouble. Because obviously the key unconditional election, Romans 8 and 9 is the foundational text for that. And if those texts can be shown to have been misinterpreted and do not teach unconditional personal election, then Reformed theology is in trouble. And that's what this book is about. Now, you may say, well, that's awfully brash of you to try to do that. Well, of course, I'm not the first. There are people throughout church history who've argued that Reformed theology's approach to hermeneutics and exegesis is flawed. And so I'm not the first one to do that. But that's the gist of the book and the point of the book. And so I begin with Augustine because my theory is this: if the headwaters are polluted, then everything downstream will be polluted. And in my opinion, the headwaters of Reformed theology, Augustinianism, I think Augustine injected a contaminant into his interpretation of Romans. And I think that contaminant continues to poison the interpretation of Romans by Reformed theologians to this day.
I agree. And one of the things is with that is one of the things I have found as I've looked into Augustine and all that, I've read like a lot of Augustine. I think I may have read most of his works. But one of the things that what's interesting is that the evolution he even takes. Like he at the beginning is like defending free will. He's like very orthodox and in line with everyone else. Yeah. And then as he goes on later, it's like, I mean, when you read his first conversation, like against like Gnostics and all that, like his letters, you're like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. And then yes, yeah. And then you read later stuff, and it's crazy. And it's because there is some weird, not like Gnostic, I would argue, still Gnostic and Manichaean influence through other things.
So,
but real quick, I have a question here from Mike. Sorry, hey man, it is what it is. Mike Lyon says, individuals, and this is a quote, are born doomed from the womb to a certain death and are to glorify him, being God, by their destruction. Kelvin, how is that not limiting salvation / a limited atonement? First thing, before you answer that, you guys both can take your whack at it. I just will give my whack at it real quick. Just because John Calvin never taught limited atonement, I never said that John Calvin was also consistent, okay? So with a lot of things that he didn't say those things, he walks some of those things back in other areas, avoiding the obvious conclusion of certain stuff. So I just will say that if you read the Institutes and you pay close attention, you'll see areas where he kind of walks back certain things. But what would the one thing that he says in the Institutes was that basically it's not limited, but that the elect are scattered across the world, which is another way of just avoiding the conclusion in my mind. But Dr. Allen, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, notice in the statement here by Calvin, there is no statement here about the extent of the atonement.
Right.
What you have in this statement is what Reformed theology says is the intent of the atonement. And the intent of the atonement, according to Reformed theology, is to save the elect only. right? However, Calvin and all the first generation of the Reformed argued that the extent of the atonement was universal. The intent, one must distinguish between intent, extent, and application. And much of the error that comes by the high Calvinists on this subject is pointed out by moderate Calvinists. That's a term, by the way, that means a Calvinist who affirms an unlimited atonement, who rejects limited atonement. Calvin was a moderate Calvinist by that definition. It is very clear from Calvin's statements that Jesus died for the sins of all people in the world. Calvin says in more than one occasion, when the term many is used in Isaiah 53, Calvin says in his sermon on that, many means all. And Calvin says it's not just that Christ died for all kinds of people in the world or some Jews and Gentiles. No, that many means all and all means all. And so Calvin actually is clear. There's really no debate anymore on Calvin. Even Calvin scholars have admitted, yes, it appears Calvin taught an unlimited atonement. And so the point is, one has to distinguish between the intent of the atonement. Now, Calvin is a Calvinist, and he believes that the intent of God is to save those whom he has elected, and that God's intent and will is not to save the non-elect. And therefore, Calvin teaches that. That's what that statement means, by the way. And so it is true that the non-elect are not going to be saved according to Reformed theology and according to Calvin. But what is not true, according to Calvin, is that the non-elect are not going to be saved because there's no atonement made for them, because Calvin says that the atonement was made for all in order to make people doubly culpable. That's Calvin's phrase, doubly culpable, because there's an atonement made for them out of the love of God, and yet they've rejected it. And so they are doubly culpable. And so even though they are not elect, they are still punished for their sins. Calvin believed in a universal atonement, which is defined as a universal satisfaction for sin. All sins of all people have been satisfied for, according to Calvin. By the way, the same is true for Augustine. Augustine said Jesus died for the sins of Judas. You can't hold a limited atonement and believe that. And plus, there are myriads of statements where Augustine clearly says that Jesus died for the sins of the world. And he doesn't just use the word world, he uses the word humanity. In fact, he'll sometimes say all humanity. So it's really clear, both in Augustine and Calvin, that they affirmed an unlimited atonement.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of what I noticed as well. That was like so that the other reformers kind of developed over time. But like actually, Pascal Flowers here says that while limited atonement is a logical deduction, no scripture argument to be found.
That's actually true. There is no valid scriptural argument for limited atonement. In fact, in my book, Calvinism, a Biblical and Theological Critique, that I edited with Steve Lemke, my chapter in that book is on the extent of the atonement.
Mm-hmm.
And I list, there are, now don't hold me, I can't remember if it's 17 or 18 or whatever. There are basically 17 or 18 arguments for limited atonement. All but one of those arguments are philosophical and theological and logical.
Mm-hmm.
There's only one of those 18 that even attempts to draw out of Scripture, and there are only 4 verses that Calvinists use. Matthew 1:21, call his name Jesus, he will save his people. Well, there it is, Dr. Allen, his people. Well, wait a minute, hold the phone. His people there, as all exegetical commentaries say, including Reformed, his people means Israel there. In fact, the phrase his people occurs, I think, 11 times in the Greek New Testament. And in every case, I repeat, every case, it means Israel. And the idea of the elect qua elect, the unborn elect, the unbelieving elect who are on the earth, the elect forever and ever in Reformed theology, that's a Reformed dogmatic position, but is not a biblical position. In the Bible, every reference to elect, people that are elect, is a reference to believers. There is no reference to anyone who is elect in Scripture who is not already a believer.
Correct. Yeah.
Elect is a synonym for believers. The concept, the Reformed dogma of the unbelieving elect and the unborn elect, the elect qua elect in the mind of God. Let's just assume for a minute. Just say that might be true. Let's say that could be true. All right, but my point is this: if it is, it's not true biblically. None of that is ever stated in Scripture.
Right. And that is actually something that I think is very beneficial for people to know as well, because like recently I had Dr. Joshua Ferris on the channel, and we talked about the atonement, because he debated limited atonement with Dr. James White and what's his name? Oh gosh, I forget his name. Anyway, Pastor Notier, Jeremiah.
Something like that.
And with Dan Chapa, and they debated the topic. And
right.
And one of the things that was very clear to me was how the passages used to get to limited atonement are
Right.
so absurdly twisted. But they really are. Like, I'm like, that is not any natural reading of any text ever. But I'm also on record saying that I think, and Dr. Allen, you do not have to agree with me. You don't even have to say where you stand on this part. But that's why I said I'm on record many times saying it's so late in the game, due to what I've understood of how Christ redeemed the cosmos. All of that, I think, is a heresy. I'm not saying you're a damnable heresy, you're going to hell, but I'm like, I think it's a straight up like, no, that is actually is cheapening the work of Christ, which no matter where you stand on Calvinism itself, that feel like that L there really does cheapen it. But anyway.
Jesus did not die for the sins of the demonic world, for example.
Right.
I mean, that's part of what you're saying, right? In other words, Scripture makes it clear the atonement is the key. I mean, the incarnation is the key to the atonement. Jesus assumed human nature, and that's what he died for. He did not die for the demonic world.
Right. No. Yeah, exactly. So now when it comes to some of that stuff, Jordan, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kill you there. We'll have to move on to, by the way, real quick, people, if you have questions, start putting them in the chat here shortly. Start it with a capital Q or something so I can see it. I will star them. We're going to try to go through your questions soon. Dr. Allen has to go here shortly. Yeah. So
you got to give me a shot at this atonement thing.
Well, we'll have to talk. What are you talking? Wait, are you talking about like penal substitution atonement, or like
no? I'm talking about what Calvin believed about the atonement.
Oh, okay.
I disagree. So first, I would say that yes,
I'm shocked.
I've read your. You sent me your thing. I read it. I understand that you can find places where Calvin, affirms universal atonement. Calvin wrote just volumes and volumes and volumes. He had no word processor. Okay. What he wrote at the end of his life was this, a treatise on the eternal predestination of God. There's the Henry Cole's translation is of one copy. The JKS Reed is like a compilation of 12. And this is at the end of his life. So if you look at page 150 and 151 in this one, and 148 and 149 in this one, and if I go to your book on Calvinism, where the one where you were the editor, one of the guys in there says, here's an argument for limited atonement, and the argument is that Christ died for the sins of the elect all over the world, and they're mingled in with the reprobate. The way that he words that, that's an argument Calvin uses in both of these. And let me just read what he wrote. Quote, "Now we will not permit the common solution of the question to avail on the present occasion, which would have it that Christ suffered sufficiently for all men, but effectually for his elect alone. This great absurdity, by which our monk has procured for himself so much applause amongst his own fraternity, holds no weight whatsoever with me." So if you're arguing that Calvin believed that Christ was suffered sufficiently for all, but only for, he calls that a great absurdity. And that, I mean, that's just, I'm just reading him, and I don't want to talk about this, because I'd rather talk about the other stuff.
I think I addressed that. I don't remember, and we can maybe come back and do.
Yeah, we should.
I think I've addressed that though in my big book, The Extent of the Atonement.
Yeah,
I have 50 pages in that book on Calvin. 50 pages.
Yeah, I'm just saying you can read him and get both.
Yeah. Now I will have to push back.
Like I said, not consistent. I said that he's not consistent.
Actually you can't, because there is no place where Calvin affirms limited atonement. None. But there are 36 where he affirms unlimited atonement. And so the preponderance of evidence is overwhelming. But I'm happy we can chat.
Yeah, we should talk about this later. But just
at another point. Yeah.
At another juncture.
He explains away 1 Timothy in this same place. And penal substitution, the atonement for the satisfaction of the wrath of God, which is what Calvin believed, that entails limited atonement. If the wrath of God has been satisfied for someone, the wrath of God no longer remains on them, they're saved. So, I mean, there's 4 things there. But like I said, I don't want to talk about this because I want to talk about your Romans book.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this. Right. Yeah, let me just say this before we go on to the next topic. What you just described is a mistaken way of thinking about it, because what you are assuming is that the mechanism of the atonement is a commercialistic mechanism. And that is the error that is made by all high Calvinists on the atonement, that the mechanism is commercially oriented, but yet Scripture actually doesn't teach that. That's a failure to understand the metaphor of death language. Now,
I read your refutations of it, and I totally agree. So,
all right, we're gonna move forward here. Jordan, you disagreeable little sheep.
I'm sorry.
So it's like I can't take you anywhere. I'm just kidding.
While you're gathering your thoughts, if somebody wants confirmation of what David was saying, they should read On the Predestination of the Saints by Augustine. Read that book. I gave that to my Calvinist, relative, and he handed it back to me. He said, "I don't know why you had me read this, because it's everything I believe." So Calvin, it's from Augustine.
Yeah.
And a second thing is that if you go to like New Advent and you read about the life of Augustine, the reason he came to Romans the way that he did was because of his solution to the problem of evil. That's where his philosophy came from. And something that I was super impressed with Dr. Allen's book is that it used the word nominalism more than once.
Yes.
Okay, right. So
voluntarism.
Yes. But nominalism, Chesterton says nominalism is a confession that Christianity has failed. And he was talking about Calvin and Augustine. So what Augustine developed his nominalism and voluntarism from the book of Genesis. And Calvin repeats all of that. That's where the philosophical voluntarism comes from. It's where the theological voluntarism comes from. And again, Dr. Allen has the quote in his book. And other than my book, I'd never seen anybody quote Calvin where he affirms theological voluntarism. So again, another thing I was impressed with
from your book.
Well, another thing that was impressive with your book is, the people that you found to quote from was just astounding to me. Keith Lee, I know everybody knows Keith Lee, and I like a lot of what Keith Lee writes. But some of those other people I'm like underlining all of that and putting the exclamation marks next to it. Just, the book is worth buying just for all of that, all of the quotes and
Well,
yeah,
Thank you,
that's
man. I deeply appreciate it. There are 607 footnotes in a 250 page book, and 27 of those pages at the end are bibliography.
yes.
So, you've got about 225 page book that has 607 footnotes in it.
by the way, just so everyone knows, those are the best books.
It was impressive. Yes.
I say that because also my bibliography wasn't that big of mine, so mine's not one of the best books. But the best books are one of the I was just reading. I finished one of the David De Silva's books, and I was reading on Kindle Scribe, and I was surprised when I got to the end. I was like, "Wait, how much?" And I flipped. I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's like 300 pages of notes and bibliography."
Okay.
Which is a great sign.
Before you move on to questions, give me a couple more shots, Will. Come on.
Well, we don't have much longer, so yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna go quick. Okay,
so pick one.
So I told you about this book, Dr.
You get
Allen,
one.
Yeah,
that you need to get this. Okay,
I do have it. I've got that.
Okay, so page 39. Accordingly, everything that happens of necessity as he has ordained. And then you quoted the Westminster Confession, where it says things fall out contingently. And the thing that I wanted to point out to you is that when you talk about necessity and contingency, if something is contingent, it's dependent upon somebody else's choice. So like I put in an offer on a house, and it's like contingent upon, buyer's acceptance, or contingent upon an inspection, right? That's what contingent means. It can go either way. Contingent is the opposite of necessity. So you would think that with Calvin saying everything that happens of necessity, then that would be in conflict with what the Westminster Confession says, but things fall out contingently. But they're using that double word definition because God is a necessary being and you and I are contingent beings. So when they say things fall out contingently, and they argue that you have it's contingent on your choice, that's not what they mean at all. What they mean is that contingent creatures do of necessity what God has willed and determined.
That's right.
Okay, so you see that. Okay, right. So one other thing, you used the word faith, and you said faith is not a gift. And Will is just he's ready to kill me now. Okay, so faith has two definitions. Where's my mic? Okay, so Calvin defines faith in three different ways. The one faith is just like the faith that's been delivered to us. So like the scriptures, that's the faith.
Right.
He defines faith as the ability to believe. Okay? Because you're totally depraved, you are unable to do anything good, and believing as God is something good. So it's total inability. You are unable to believe. So God has to give you the ability to believe, and that is the gift of faith. The gift of faith, the ability to believe, brings regeneration. And regeneration precedes faith. But how many times does the word faith show up in Ephesians 2:8? This is by grace being saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. They're saying that the gift of God in Ephesians 2:8 is the gift. And Calvin says that. Because he quotes Augustine, saying that in Ephesians 2:8, faith is the gift. But that does not mean believing. It means the ability to believe. That's what monergism is. That if you look at Lorraine Boatner's the Doctrine of Reformed Predestination, I think it's called, he says, you do not believe in order to be born again. You are born again in order that you will believe. And Augustine says God compels people to believe. How does God compel people to believe? By giving them the gift of the ability to believe. So you are saved by the ability to believe before you are justified, before you believe. And they obfuscate that by using the word faith. And faith is a work because faith is believing. Paul says, if you confess with your mouth, believe in your heart, those are things that you do. Things that you do are works. As you rightly point out, Paul is saying that works of the law do not save you. So works, he means works of the law, and works that he's saying that you're not saved by works. He's saying you're not saved by doing enough good things.
Correct.
Okay, but you are saved by the work of believing in the one God has sent, which is what Jesus told the Pharisees.
Right.
Paul says you have to believe on the name of the Lord Jesus, confess with the mouth. Those are things you do. Faith is a verb. It's faithing, it's believing in, it's trusting in. So it's something you do. So faith is a work. And that's why James says it's not intellectual assent alone. We are justified by works and not by intellectual assent alone, not by faith alone. And John says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us. Again, those are things so faith is a work, but faith is not the work of righteousness or works of the law, the Mosaic law. Okay. So and I have a whole document on that. I have a huge document on that I can send.
I agree. I'm in agreement.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So before we get too lost in the weeds on that, sorry, there are people who have asked questions and I want to make sure we get to them. Yep. And Jordan, I've been a really good friend with you for a long time. So I also know how you
tell me to shut up. I'm listening.
Well, what ends up happening also, by the way, if you guys ever need something, by the way, if you have a question, you can send Jordan an email or something and he will respond to you and he will write a lot. And I will say it's usually worth reading. Okay. And by usually, I mean, always. So he's helped me quite a bit. So as much crap as I give him, I need everyone to understand he's like my dad. So we have that anyway, I just don't want people to think that.
Let me plug this.
So
on my Not a Tame Sheep YouTube channel, I did an episode on how Aquinas used divine simplicity to break the chain of determinism. And I explained this stuff about causation and everything in that video. And it's, I don't know, 30, 40, I think it's 40 minutes long. If you want to see that stuff I was talking about, I detail all that in there.
Well, and if you want, Jordan, when this video posts, put a link in the comments below. I'll pin it to the top because that's probably beneficial for people. All right. So real quick. First off, there's a gentleman here named Callie. It's with a K.
Wife?
No, yeah, my wife is Callie with
they
a C.
Ask if you wrote
Callie.
A book?
No, but he said, found this channel today. Thank you for your time and efforts. Putting this content is a ton of work, and I'm so grateful. So thank you for the $10 super chat. But also want to say this. He said earlier, I was trying to find it, and I couldn't find it, but he said he's a new believer. Callie said they're in the new believer within...
Is that a she or a he?
It's she, I think.
Yeah, that's Kaylee. I'd probably pronounce
Kaylee. Okay. Oh, that makes more sense.
Refund her money. You mispronounced her.
Well, that's such a tradition on the church split. I mispronounce everything. So ask.
Yeah. So welcome to the channel.
Yeah. But Kaylee, she said that she's a new believer. New within the last year, and that this conversation was extremely helpful because they had found Reformed theology originally. So I think that's really, really good. But also, I even asked, I know many Calvinists reject the idea of infant damnation, but I don't see how it provides an exception for infants in their theology. Can you steel man their argument here? Dr. Allen, that's kind of general, but I feel like that could you take that one? Oh,
yes. Yes. Well, there's a point. There's a place in the book in that very chapter that you said you liked a lot, that chapter on total depravity, talks about Augustine's understanding of the soul and Augustine's understanding of original sin. And basically what Augustine did in order to pull all this together is he came to the conclusion that in order for an infant to be able to go to heaven, that infant has to be baptized because it is the baptism that deals with original sin. It's that baptism that brings regeneration and deals with original sin. And you can read that. I kind of tease that out, how Augustine makes that argument. Now, what else Augustine does, he said, no, by the way, an infant can't exercise their will, right? It's their baptism that saves them, right? It's somebody else who brings them and has them baptized. And in the same way, Augustine says, that's how adults are saved. They can't come with their will either. They're like that infant because of total depravity entails, according to Reformed theology and Augustine, total inability. And therefore, God has to give you, he has to elect you in eternity past. And then he has to, according to most Calvinists, regenerate you, which is a monergistic act, then grant you the gift of faith. And then you believe. It's your belief, though, although you can't not believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not true libertarianism, but you will believe because you want to believe. This is Calvinism, right? And so this is how all of that goes together in Augustine's theology. Now, I don't know if you put the question back up where I can see it again one more time. Oh yeah, infant damnation, right? They do. Many Calvinists reject that, particularly Baptists who are Calvinists in their soteriology. They reject this. Al Mohler rejects that. My friend Danny Aiken is a 4-point Calvinist. He rejects that. Most Baptists are going to reject the idea of infant damnation and believe that the blood of Christ covers infants who die in infancy, and I certainly think that is true. By the way, the only key verse in Scripture you can go to there outside of a theological argument would be David's son with Bathsheba, and I think you can use that. That's a legitimate text to try to make this case. But yes, many Calvinists will say that, well, we can't know whether all infants are going to be saved because if they're not elect, they're damned. And I'm not going to name names, but I can tell you people that do say that and have said that, and you probably can too.
James White. What? That was weird.
Yeah.
That was a whole thing during Battlegate. Anyway, so Michael Barger asked, the Bargster, that's his nickname. That's awesome. All right. So if original sin were true, and I'm guessing this is the Augustinian original sin, that's what most people mean when they say it. And we were born with a sin nature, wouldn't have the apostles mentioned this frequently, and I don't think Christ would have said you must be converted and become as little children if we are born in this corrupted state as they define it. So
yeah, it is interesting that the concept of original sin is, in terms of that terminology, is not a biblical phrase. Now Augustine did use the phrase, and there were a few who used it before him. And there is a section in here in that very chapter 3 on what I think is the biblical way to describe or define original sin. But whatever you do with it, I don't believe it entails guilt. I don't think it entails that we have inherited Adam's guilt. Now, Augustine argued that. That was his whole point. He invented that. But today, among the Reformed, there's a big debate over whether humanity has inherited Adam's guilt. The Reformed certainly believe in original sin, so do I, rightly defined. But the many of the Reformed do not believe in original guilt, right? And I think that's the key there. That's the key point there. And I bring all that up and walk through that and show where Augustine argued that and how that became his foundation for infant baptism, and how it became his way out for infants to miss damnation by virtue of being baptized.
Yeah, original sin is Adam and Eve's sin. What they really mean is federal headship of Adam.
Yeah.
When they're talking about original sin, they mean federal headship. And, the best way to counter that is to give the correct explanation. When you look at Romans, like Romans 1, the Jews had the Mosaic law. And Paul is saying to the Jews, as Dr. Allen pointed out, that the Gentiles had what Aquinas called natural law. If you want to know what natural law is, read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. So Paul is saying, look, Gentiles had natural law, Jews had Mosaic law. You're on the same footing. Then, the famous verse, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But Paul tells you what he means. He says all Jews and all Gentiles have sinned. That's his point.
Yeah, he's talking about
right.
generally across the board.
Right. Then he continues on and goes back to Abraham. He's saying, look, the Jews go back to Abraham. And he says, look, this is what you're doing, Jews. You're going back to Abraham. And then what does Paul do? He says, who came before Abraham? That's Adam. And who comes from Adam? All Jews and all Gentiles. So his point isn't that it's this federal headship of Adam where we were all in Adam's loins and we're all guilty of Adam's sin. Therefore, as Augustine, decided, if you didn't get baptized and have that original sin washed off, then you went to hell.
Right.
So that's the wrong, explaining it rightly. This is what Paul meant, that all Jews came from Adam, all Gentiles came from Adam. You're all sinners. And you all need Christ.
And in Adam, at the original sin, the first sin, if you will, that happened.
Yeah.
We all inherited essentially what I would call a death nature. I'm with Dr. Pritchett on this one.
A lot of people like to use the terminology original death.
Right. Yes.
You hear that used a lot. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's true. So real quick, I have 2 follow-up questions here. And so Mind Warden's harassing you even more, Jordan, by the way. Says it was nice of Will and Dr. Allen to have Jordan on today. So the real quick follow-up for you, we're going to do these 2 questions and then we'll close out because I know, Dr. Allen, you have got to go. So question, follow-up. What is the original sin definition that Dr. Allen believes in? What would be a quick synopsis of what your view would be?
Page 46 is where you need to go for that. What I do on page 46 is I quote Oliver Crisp's article on this subject.
I love that man. He's good.
And Tom McCall's agreement with it. Now, here's what's interesting. Crisp is a Calvinist, moderate Calvinist, right? And Tom McCall is an Arminian. He's not a Calvinist, but they both agree on this basic definition, a 7-point definition. And I basically agree with it too. Now, there is a caveat at point number 2. It's in a footnote in the book, footnote 150 there. But Michael, the answer to your question is basically right there on page 46. There's a 7-point statement that I think most non-Calvinists and many Calvinists would affirm. Now, some Calvinists are going to carry this further and say that original sin entails original guilt or entails inherited guilt. Neither Chris, by the way, rejects that as a Calvinist, and obviously Tom McCall, as a non-Calvinist theologian, rejects it. I reject that as well, and obviously you both reject it. But page 46 is the place to go to get all the nuances of that.
I have it circled in a note next to it.
Okay.
But I can't say anything because I got to please Mind Warden. What I would say is really helpful is Calvin talks about how Adam was created with rectitude of nature. Rectitude is the ability to go straight. And what was lost in the garden was rectitude of nature. We no longer have the ability to go through. Our nature isn't straight. Our nature is bent. And if you want an explanation of that, C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet, where he talks about how people are bent, and that's what he's saying. We don't have rectitude of nature anymore. Our nature is, instead of our nature being ordered to the good, and the good being God. Which, again, is interesting. If you read in Genesis, Eve looked at the fruit and saw that it was good for food because their nature was ordered to the good. Our nature is now ordered to the good of ourselves.
Right.
So, and that's the rectitude of nature that was lost. It's not that we don't know what good and evil is or that we're unable to do any good whatsoever. It's that we're doing the good selfishly. Yeah, right. And I think Will wrote a book, Amber. I'll be happy to come on your show and talk about it.
Also, on in chapter 4 of my own book, I walk through that very view. So if someone wants to pick up Crusher the Great Serpent, you're more than welcome. But I would definitely recommend picking up Dr. Allen's books. All links in the descriptions below, because I saw Callie was asking that. And it's Callie, by the way. So that's how
Oh,
she
it is
pronounced
Callie.
it.
Okay.
So we are all kind of right and all kind of wrong all at the same time. So
I have a daughter named Kaylee, and that's why I thought her name, and it's
yeah.
spelled that way. And that's why I thought it was Kaylee.
my wife is Callie, so my brain went
Yeah.
Callie. I was like, oh no, but it's not with a C. So anyway, okay. Well, and then final follow-up, and then we'll close up shop and point everyone to the directions.
Yeah, this is a good question.
Yep, follow-up. Very interesting. Thanks. I understand that explanation. But even if we accept that, if limited atonement is true, wouldn't it mean necessarily that some infants are not part of the elect? What
Yes,
would you say
it
to
would.
that, Doc?
Yes, it would, and here is why. If limited atonement is true, then nobody who is a member of the class of the non-elect, including infants that are members of that class, nobody in that class has an atonement for their sin by definition. And therefore, they could not be saved, because everybody agrees no one can be saved apart from the atonement of Christ. And so the point of the question is, if limited atonement is true and an infant dies who is not one of the elect, then they could not be saved by definition, because there's no atonement for their sin.
Right.
So that's the point that needs to be made.
Amen. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Augustine said some infants are in hell. Calvin said some infants are in hell.
Right.
Edwards famously said there's infants in hell.
Right.
And Vodi Bakum said they're vipers and diapers. So
Yeah. And then, in covenant theology is how Calvin had some infants are elect. It is because you're in the covenant, and because they were post the tribulation is they were post millennium, because Calvin was post millennial and we're building the kingdom. Then if you're part of the covenant, then your children are born in the covenant. So if they die in infancy, then he can tell you that your kids will go to heaven. But if you're a pagan or whatever, and your kid dies, then they go to hell.
Yeah, right. And of course the question is, where is that in the Bible?
Well, yeah.
Jesus, suffer on all the little children come unto me.
Yeah.
Calvinists say children suffer.
Yeah,
that's their answer. Is suffer little children come unto me, and to the Calvinists they just suffer in hell. So anyway, all right. So real quick, Dr. Allen, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I've watched you on a lot of other programs. I've read your books, and I've always enjoyed your just general, like, when I talk to certain people or listen to other people, there's certain people who are in this space that you can just tell is very intellectual and all that. But there's other people that are in this space that not only are intellectual, but you can also tell, for the way Jordan and I will put it, is that they're actually Christian about it too. Like, they have like his joy of Christ and all that. You always have had that, and I've always appreciated that about you, where it feels that way a lot. And I really like your work. I love what you do. Jordan and I both have talked about how we highly respect what you're doing. So anyway, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Now, if people want more of your stuff and more things that Dr. Allen puts out, because Dr. Allen famously has that book of like 800 ridiculous pages. Where's the best place for people to find more information?
Well, there are two places they can go. I have a personal website, Dr. DrDavidLAllen.org. They can go there and find my books and resources and buy them through Amazon. The other place they can go is preachingcoach.com. Preachingcoach.com. One of my ministries, of course, I teach preaching at Mid-America Theological Seminary in Memphis. And one of my ministries is coaching pastors in their preaching. And so I've got a number of clients that I work with. We meet on Zoom. People can find out more information, by the way, if they're a pastor and they're interested in getting some coaching in their preaching. Go to preachingcoach.com and just fill out, ask for the little questionnaire at the bottom of the homepage and give us your name and your information. We'll contact you and I'll tell you about all that. But my books are available there, along with many of my sermons linked there. People can listen to my sermons if they're interested. And And so either drdavidlallen.org or David, or they can go to preachingcoach.com. Preachingcoach.com. Now, if somebody wants to get in touch with me, my email address, there are two or three of them. Let me just give you one. The easiest one is my seminary email address, dallen at mabts.edu. Abbreviation for Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary.edu, first three letters of the word education. That'll get you to me, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have, anybody might have, or assist any way that I can.
There you go. And so yeah, this is great, and I really love what you're doing. I find it's because Jordan and I are both from the Mecca of Calvinism, essentially, in West Michigan.
Sure.
And because
the Calvinist Bible Belt,
yeah, it is the buckle of the Calvinist Bible Belt,
right.
And being around there, just so Dr. Allen, I mentioned to you pre-show that I am a youth pastor as my day job right now, but I was a lead pastor when I was in Michigan. But one of the things is that whenever I talk to young kids up there, most of their struggles of the faith and leaving the faith or wanting to just be done with church, it was all because of Calvinistic presuppositions. So like being able to walk through people and unpack those things. So your work actually is very beneficial, because I do know that people like end up not rejecting Christianity because they finally hear some other version of it. So I want, and whether Calvinists like that or not, they're like, Calvinists are true. It's like, look, I'd rather people be in the kingdom and have disagreements with me on stuff than be outside the kingdom. So that's the practical outcropping of this. And that's the whole point of the church split, is to have conversations that can be deeply theological, that can be like splitting, but not split, but instead be united still in our love for one another. So anyway, so with that said, guys, go check out Dr. Allen's books. Links are in the description below. Go check out Jordan. As much crap as we give the guy, but don't worry, guys, he dishes it out. You haven't seen the memes he makes in the Facebook group about me every week. But go check out Not a Tame Sheep, and especially Jordan. Make sure after tomorrow, when the show is uploaded, post a link to that video of you talk about Aquinas and all that, as you mentioned. We'll post it as well. So, but guys,
Church Split Apologetics Facebook group.
Okay, yeah, I could do that too.
Yeah, if people, if you're new seeing this and you want to get in on the discussion, we do have a Facebook group.
Yes. So you can look up the Church Split discussion on apologetics, and you can just join us there. We have like 30 less members in Trinity Radio, and nothing would give me more pleasure than to tell Braxton and Jonathan that my group grew bigger. So
there you go.
Send everyone. All right, cool.
Maybe you should spend some time there.
Oh no, I much prefer letting you run the group. I just lurk in it. All right. Enough of all this nonsense. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, Dr. Allen.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, guys. All right, so guys, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ dwell with you all richly. So take care. We'll see you in the next one.